Hello everybody. Can you all hear me? Good. You're all very welcome tonight. Thank you. So I'll keep my opening remarks brief and leave plenty of time for Jimmy. So you're very welcome to the third Rosemary Sheehan Memorial Lecture, which this year is hosted by the Iona Institute in Skellig. Skellig is an informal discussion group, partly led by Professor Ray Kinsella, that covers some of the same topics as Iona and is interesting, both named after these islands, Iona and Skellig. That was completely coincidental. I was thinking back to when Rachel and I first met Rosemary and Jimmy, and from what I can recall, we were introduced to each other by Otto and Mary Hersham in the St. Stephen's Green Club in the city centre. Otto, who was Viennese, was then managing director of the Irish Catholic, and I had been editor of the paper for about 1 year at that point. So that was in 1997 or so, about 25 years ago, not today or yesterday, in other words. Jimmy and Rosemary left a deep impression on Rachel and I with her kindness and warmth, and we met at many other events in the time since then and in their home. They were both a great moral support to me down the years in my various battles in the public arena, trying to argue the Catholic cause, and also supporters of the Iona Institute. Rosemary was a very memorable lady, as anybody here who knew her knew. Her kindness and intelligence were obvious and manifest. She was always a pleasure to meet. She also had a sense of fun and, it seemed to me, a very perceptive eye. That is, she could sum people up quickly and accurately and decide this person is all right, or that person is a bit of a chancer, stay away from him. I am sure this is a big help to Jimmy in his business dealings down the years. I was reading back Jimmy's tribute book to Rosemary before preparing these brief remarks, and everyone who knew her seems to have been struck by the same qualities I have just listed and many more besides. I noted, for example, in the book that she was a very talented singer, harpist and pianist, all in all a woman for all seasons when added to everything else. As for Jimmy, he has built one of the most consequential medical legacies of anyone in Ireland in decades. Many of you will be familiar with it, and Jimmy will talk about it more in his talk, so I won't anticipate that here. Apart from the excellence of his hospitals, Jimmy has ensured that they are run according to Catholic medical ethics, which of course adds to their excellence. Catholic healthcare, of course, has been under furious attack lately. The latest round of attacks was sparked by the decision to move the National Maternity Hospital to the St. Vincent's campus not far from here, and the nuns got thoroughly demonised again. But the Catholic Church has a very proud legacy in healthcare, stretching back right to the beginning of Christianity 2,000 years ago. The Catholic Church founded the very first hospitals in Europe aimed at ordinary people, and today it runs 5,000 hospitals worldwide, as well as 16,000 health clinics, annually, so helping millions annually, mainly in developing countries. Jimmy stands in this proud legacy and inheritance. Both he and Rosemary have added a new and substantial chapter of their own to it. In his talk this evening, Jimmy will talk about this chapter and how Rosemary helped to write it, and how without her there would have been no chapter at all. So ladies and gentlemen, I'll give you over to Jimmy Sheehan. Thank you.
David, thank you very much. I'd like to welcome everybody here tonight and thank you for coming along. Bishop Eamon, Reverend Fathers, Reverend Sisters, family, friends and parishioners. I'm delighted that you're here to honour Rosemary's memory tonight with me. It's a great pleasure to have you here. When David and Ray Kinsella asked me to give this talk, I did so with some hesitancy because what can I say about the most wonderful person I've ever known and the extraordinary 52 years that I was so privileged to share with her. And I was somewhat reluctant because I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to honour her adequately with my talk. But thank you for coming and sharing it with me. I'm going to talk about our journey to Bishop Eamon, if he would say an opening prayer of Cardinal Newman, which applies to everybody here tonight. And I think it's a very appropriate prayer that we might start our discussion with tonight. So Bishop Eamon will very kindly come tonight, and I'd be delighted if you would open this prayer.
Have it here.
Have it on the screen. Yeah.
When I read this meditation, I really felt that it was Jimmy's philosophy of saying thanks to God for the gifts that he's been given. As we say, God has created me to do him some definite service. He has committed some work to me which he has not committed to another. I have my vision for this life. I may never know it in this life, but I shall be told it in the next. He has not created me for naught. On all our behalf, thank you, Jimmy.
Now, my journey in healthcare started a long time ago, in 1956. That was the year where the Nobel Prize was awarded for the invention of the transistor. The cardiac catheter was designed and invented in that time, and the polio vaccine was introduced. These were all major changes in 1956. And Doris Day sang Que Sera, Sera. And I think the words of her song are very appropriate to my talk tonight.
When I was just a little girl, I asked my mother, what will I be? Will I be pretty? Will I be rich? Here's what she said to me. Que sera, sera. Whatever will be, will be. The future's not ours to see. Que sera, sera. What will be, will be.
When I graduated from Vincent's, or when I did my intern year after my student days, it was in the old Vincent's in St. Stephen's Green. Vincent's was what we call a Nightingale type hospital, and in those days the wards were open. They had windows on both sides, they were well ventilated and well lit, and you can see the presence of the religious sisters in the wards in quantity. The wards were gleaming, and in those days when Nightingale hospitals were built, about 80% of the hospital was ward accommodation. You only had about 20% for other ancillary areas. At that stage it was kitchens, laundry and other such. And you'll see as my talk goes on how that has changed over the time. After graduating and doing my intern year, I decided I'd like to specialise in orthopedics. And I went out to the orthopedic hospital in Kappa. Now in those days, Kappa was very much an open-air hospital for children because most of the patients were either suffering from the effects of polio, congenital defects or tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was still rampant at that time. Not so much, not that active, but a lot of the ill effects of tuberculosis, particularly people who developed it in their bone. I was in Kappa for about 4 months, and at that stage we didn't get an enormous salary. I think I got about 20 Irish punts a month at that stage as my salary. And I thought, when I looked at it and I saw the deductions for tax, I thought I was being sort of overtaxed. So I decided to look into the situation. Now, in the office in Kappa, this was before HSE years, there was only 2 people working in the office. There was one girl who was senior, and there was a young girl who had just joined the office. She was doing a locum job for a few months, waiting to be called into the bank. Her name was Rosemary. And I brought my pay slip into the office, and I showed them my pay slip. And I said, look, is there anything I can do about this? I seem to be taxed too much. So this young girl, Rosemary, 19-year-old girl at the time, took up my payslip, had a look at it, and looked up at me. She said, "Did you ever think of getting married?" Yeah. So I was somewhat taken back, but I was captivated by the mischievous twinkle in her eye and her sense of fun. So about 6 weeks later, I got the courage to invite her out. And 18 months later, I brought her to the Church of the Annunciation in Rathfarnham on the Feast of the Annunciation. And when she was on her knees, I proposed to her. And now, never one to make a rash decision. Do you know what she says to me? "I'll have to think about it." Yeah. So I said, "Look, would you ever think quickly while you're on your knees?" And in fairness to her, she was a quick thinker. And to my great relief, she said yes. And now, in those days, things weren't that simple. You had to be vetted by the senior members of your family. Now, my grand-aunt was the Mother General of the Presentation Order in Kerry. So Rosemary was brought down for vetting, and you can see the expression on their faces. There's a sort of kind of mixed reaction when you look at the faces. This picture is interesting because they're standing under the plinth of a statue. You can see the plinth of the statue. There's a statue of Christ the King, and my grandfather had donated that statue to the Presentation Convent many years before that. The Presentation Convent subsequently closed, and my sister Therese, who's with us tonight, she lives in Kerry, she's up from the Kingdom tonight, and I'm delighted to welcome her here tonight. She arranged for the statue to be transferred to a roundabout in Tralee, and the main roundabout going into Tralee from the Limerick Road has the statue of Christ the King erected on it. It was no mean feat in this secular era to have a statue erected on a roundabout. And without the help of Norma Foley, who's our present Minister of Education, and at that stage as a councillor, I don't think Therese could have ever achieved what she set out to do. It's a great tribute to her to have this statue on the main road. My aunt, by all accounts, was a formidable Reverend Mother in the order. Rumour has it that in the days before television, when they had the odd film in the convent, and these films would have been very benign, like Bing Crosby, Going My Way, or these type of films. But my aunt sat beside the projector with a white plate, and she censored anything that might have been anyway a little bit seamy, sort of from the rest of the nuns. But she ruled with a rigid rule, I think, at that time. So our journey together began in November 1966, and that's what my talk is about tonight. In those days, having worked in Ireland for 3 years, to further my training I had to emigrate because there was no training programs in those days. What you did is you selected where you'd like to go for it, and the normal period in a hospital was either 6 or 12 months. So every 6 or 12 months you had to apply for a new job. Nowadays training programs are so well scheduled for people, it's just a totally different world. But the first hospital I decided to go to was a very busy, in fact the busiest accident emergency service in the United Kingdom was in the Glasgow Royal Infirmary. And this really opened my eyes. The first night I was on duty as a registrar was Hogmanay, and I had 16 stabbings in that night, one of them fatal. I'd never seen a stabbing in Ireland because knives were not used at that stage, and I couldn't believe it. I remember I was stitching up one young guy who had a stab wound, and his father burst into the theatre, and he said, "Who did it, son?" And son said, "Jungle Boy." And the father said, "I'll get Jungle Boy for you." And I said, look, hold on a sec. If you get Jungle Boy, would you ever get them to take him to another hospital? Because I'm up to my neck here. So I don't know what ever happened to Jungle Boy. But while we were in Scotland, one of Rosemary's great talents was her musical talent. She had won the Fresh Ceol before I'd met her for singing Accompany Herself on the harp, and she was also a very talented classical musician. And I decided I'd make a short film when we were in Glasgow. Now this is going 55 years ago. It was on a cine camera, and the sound effects in those stages were very different to what you can have in video films nowadays. So I just show a very small clip of it, so you'll excuse the quality and the sound on it, but I think it's worth just getting just a short glimpse of her musical talent. My next job after Scotland was the Royal National Hospital in Stanmore. This had been recommended to me as one of the best orthopedic hospitals in the United Kingdom. And it was, again, a hospital a bit like Kappa, an open-air hospital, but they did a lot of elective surgery, no trauma. And I wasn't particularly enamoured. My appointment was for 6 months, and I decided after 6 months that I would move on. I'd been at a conference in Paris, and I heard a man speaking at it called John Charnley. He designed an artificial hip, a plastic and metal hip, and he was talking about it, and I was enamoured by what he was doing. So I discussed it with my boss in Stanmore at the time, and he said, look, that guy's a total maverick. He said, if you go and work for me, you'll probably never get another job anywhere. And he recommended I wouldn't, but I didn't take his advice. I went for an interview and I got a job with John Charnley, and it was a changing point of my entire career. So we packed our bags and we went up to Lancashire to Wrightington Hospital. Wrightington was a lovely setting for a hospital, an old house, beautiful grounds with a lake. But the hospital itself, again, was like Kappa, an open-air hospital. And the hospital itself was pretty primitive. The hip centre is the area where the cars are parked outside it. So the hospital itself really was what was going on within the hospital. At that time, John Charnley hadn't been knighted, and I'll talk about that later. But it was always rumoured, whenever it came up to the Queen's birthday or the New Year's honours list, it was always rumoured, would John Charnley be on the list? He wasn't on the list when I was actually working with him. One night when Rosemary and myself were going through notes, and I'll talk about her help to me there, we spent many evenings going through hospital notes and x-rays, looking at the development of arthritic hips, and she was an enormous help to me there. But we came across a letter in one of the patient's files sent by a doctor to John Charnley congratulating him on his knighthood. This is before he actually got it. So John Charnley's response, he was pretty blunt as usual. He said, many thanks for your congratulations, which are premature. He said, you must be mixing me up with another surgeon called Nobby Clark, was his name. And he said, you must be mixing me up with Nobby Clark, who was recently knighted for fiddling around with the toes of the members of the royal family. And that was how blunt he was. But it was a changing part of my career because John Charnley had designed, as I said, a hip joint with a plastic socket, and it had revolutionised people's lives, because up to this, people with severe arthritis were sitting in wheelchairs, they were at the fireside or lying in bed, and within a few weeks their life was totally changed by having an artificial joint inserted. And I was absolutely fascinated by this and got totally immersed in the concept of artificial joints. As I mentioned, Rosemary spent hours with me analysing the whole sequence of what happened with arthritic hips. John Charnley's situation there was very basic, but it was an example really of what can be achieved by somebody who is focused on one area, and his achievements are absolutely enormous. One of the problems I found when I was working there was that we were changing people's lives if they had arthritic hips, but a lot of people with bad hips also had bad knees, and we couldn't do anything for them. The only thing we could do was stiffen their knee, what is called an arthrodesis, or a fusion of their knee. And if you had 2 bad hips and 2 bad knees, and you ended up with great hips and stiff knees, you still couldn't do very much. So I took a particular interest in, and I said, look, I'd love to be able to do something about people with arthritic knees. And I decided that I didn't have the knowledge to progress it, but that I'd go back and study. And around that time, the University of Guildford had just started a course in bioengineering. It was the first course anywhere in the world that I know of that they had bioengineering. Medical, a little bit about. So we packed our bags and went to the university. And I took a particular interest in knee joints. This particular picture is interesting because from the time I met Rosemary, every time we went to Kerry, where my folks came from, and we went to Killarney, I took a photograph of her sitting on the same stone for 50 years. And I have an enormous collection of her in the same. This was in the miniskirt era. Now, the picture on the right of her standing was taken purely for medical reasons. Because that picture has been shown at medical knee conferences all over the world. Nobody's knees have been more exposed than Rosemary's knees. It was to show the angle that the thigh bone makes with the shin bone. People are inclined to think that your leg is straight, but you actually have a 7-degree offset between the two, and that was the only reason for taking that picture. Yeah. So I ended up with a prototype of a knee at the end of the year in Guildford, and I subsequently, when I returned to Ireland, I inserted it the following year. And over the next decade, it was adopted on a very large worldwide basis with people sort of from Australia, South Africa, throughout Europe, the United Kingdom and America, all using this knee joint for many years. So I was immensely proud to have achieved what I set out to do in Guildford. And I'll talk about the sort of travels that brought us later in the talk. This picture I put in because I always feel guilty when I look at it. When I was in Guildford, my sister Frances, who's with me here tonight, she was a medical student and she came over to spend the summer in Guildford working in the local hospital. And for the state opening of Parliament, Frances and myself went up to the opening. Rosemary couldn't come because she was working to support me. And I always remember standing in the mall, watching all the finery, eating ice cream with Frances. And I said, I really feel guilty that Rosemary couldn't even come because she's working to keep me. But she supported me for that period of time. Also during the time in Guildford, I became involved with a group in Switzerland called the AO Group. AO stands for the Association for Osteosynthesis. Osteosynthesis is fixation of bone. And it was a group of 4 surgeons who got together and they revolutionised the whole treatment of fractures, because up to that, fractures were treated largely by plaster of Paris. And this group sort of studied the mechanics, the design of plates, screws and nails, and how you would best mechanically to anchor fractures of various types. And I've had a long life association with them actually. I was honoured to be one of the founding members of their foundation and had a lifelong association with them. Every year, the first week of December, Rosemary and myself travelled to Davos. This was before the politicians became involved there. And we had a course for about 500 surgeons from all over the world, and I was part of their teaching faculty for many years. And it was a wonderful experience to have that association. Rosemary always travelled with me, and I'll mention that later. The middle slide, knee fracture, just to give you an idea. At this stage, it was considered, a bit like John Charney's scene, it was considered not correct to put in that amount of metal into anybody, and it was frowned upon by many surgeons. But it was all worked out mechanically. This particular patient was one of our Eurovision singers, involved in a severe car accident. And as you know, a lot of these people in show business were very subject to car accidents. I've looked after a lot of them over the years. But this particular Eurovision singer had a very severe fracture. That took about 5 hours plus to reconstruct. 40 years later, she has never failed to send me a mass card at Christmas. Yeah, such is the gratitude that people have and the association that we're so privileged in medicine to have with patients that we look after. Now, also, when I was in Guildford, Vincent's Hospital was moving from its Nightingale wards from the Green out to Ellen Park. The new hospital in Ellen Park had just been constructed, and you notice now how the design has changed from the Nightingale era. In 1938, GE introduced the fluorescent tube, and that meant that you could have lighting in a much deeper floor plate, so that the hospitals now had much deeper floor plates. You didn't have the ventilation on both sides of the ward. You had artificial ventilation very often, much smaller windows, and hospitals now became blocks, very unattractive blocks, a lot of them, and this persisted for many years. But Vincent was due to open, and I got a phone call inviting me to join the staff. Now, I was very hesitant because I was still at what I consider a very early stage in my training. And also, having been in Vincent's, there was a very formidable group of consultants there that I had trained with and was an intern there. And I found it a bit off-putting, the thought, because most of them were twice my age, and I was a little bit hesitant at the thought of coming back to join the staff. But the last orthopedic appointment before that was 9 years before. And if I didn't accept the job, I probably wouldn't have had an opportunity of returning to Ireland. Now, just to mention a few of my colleagues, and sadly they're all deceased, so I can talk about them freely at this stage. Fergus Dunham was a neurosurgeon. His ward in the old St. Vincent's, you won't believe it, was called the Ache in Head ward. Such an appropriate name for a neurosurgical ward, after Mother Mary Aikenhead, the founder of the order. But Fergus was the most undiplomatic person I've ever met in my life. I asked him one day to see a patient who had lost their voice. They were aphasic. They had a brain lesion and couldn't speak. He came in and stood at the end of the bed and he said, "Hello, chatterbox." Could you imagine in this day and age? There was another young lady, a very sad case. She was in the psychiatric ward. She had postpartum depression, and she went from the psychiatric ward up to the 5th floor and jumped out the window on the 5th floor and survived. She had multiple injuries, and I reconstructed her and presented her at the surgical conference, our weekly conference. And after presenting her and all the things, that we always said, "Has anyone any questions?" And Fergus puts up his hand and he said, "Was the elevator stuck?" Could you imagine that diplomacy in this day and age? Bob O'Connell kept everybody amused with his stories. My favourite story of Bob O'Connell was there was always great rivalry between Vincent's and the Mater in those years. And Bob was asked, what's the difference between the Mater and the Vincent's as he saw it? He said, it's pretty simple. It's like this. In Vincent's, when we have our annual dinner, we have it in the Russell Hotel. The Russell was the best eatery in town at the time. In the Mater, when they have their annual dinner, they have it in the zoo. Yeah. D.K. O'Donovan was a very formidable character, and we were all afraid of D.K. He trained in Toronto with two doctors called Banting and Best who discovered insulin, and they revolutionised the treatment of diabetes, which couldn't be treated up to that. And Fergus came back as a specialist, or D.K. came back as a specialist in diabetes. When he gave his talk to the students, his clinic on diabetes, he sort of explained, there's too much sugar in your blood, it's excreted in the urine, and the urine has a high concentration of glucose. And then he produces a beaker of urine, and he dips his finger into it and tastes the urine. And he said the urine will taste sweet. And then he passed the beaker around to everybody to do likewise. And people just hated the thought of dipping their finger in, and they were nauseated after it. When everyone had finished and were feeling quite seedy, He said, now, I don't know if you noticed, when I dipped my index finger into the beaker, I put my long finger into my mouth. He said, lesson number 1 for a good doctor is the power of observation. Yeah. So, Harold Quinlan was one of the real old-timers. He often did rounds in morning suit, and whenever he went to listen to a patient's chest with the stethoscope, he always said, now, please turn around towards nurse and cough. Could you imagine in this COVID era doing that with a patient and getting away with it? When you're appointed in those days, I never sent in a curriculum. You were invited to join the staff, and I was invited to go and meet the Mother General. I was interested in those days. Rosemary and myself were invited to meet the Mother General, and so we both went up for interview, and she interviewed me and gave me my credentials. It was Mother Teresa Anthony, an extraordinary lady, and I get so upset when I see the bad press that the Sisters of Charity get. I'm delighted to welcome 2 of them tonight who are in the other room inside, who've come to the talk tonight, who worked with me in Vincent's. They've done extraordinary work over 2 centuries, and without their help in the hospitals over the years, we will be nowhere like where we are. And I think it's so sad. To me, I have the greatest respect for what they've done and continue to do under very difficult circumstances. I was in Kappa a few months, and at that stage Kappa, as I mentioned, was mainly children, and polio was under control. The vaccine had eliminated it. Tuberculosis was treated with antibiotics. There was very few children left in Kappa, and there was a question that Kappa might close down. So I wrote a short report for Mother Teresa Anthony suggesting that why don't we start a joint replacement unit in Kappa. And she sent for me, and I went up and met her, explained what I had in mind, and she gave me a blank cheque. I needed a new operating theatre and a small research area, and she said, go ahead and do it. And such was her foresight, she didn't question anything else about it. Kappa has gone from that stage. I was the 4th surgeon appointed on the staff in Kappa. It now has 36 surgeons on it, and it's the 2nd largest joint replacement unit in the British Isles. And it puts an enormous throughput, and it's all due to the foresight of Mother Teresa Anthony that it happened. And I must say, I think she was an extraordinary woman, as were so many of her colleagues in that order. This is the first sterile air theatre in Kappa that she financed for me. Surgeons in those days, we wore a spacesuit, and were connected up then to an external vent so that our expired air couldn't contaminate the patient in any way, and we operated in a small glass enclosure. Now, when you're appointed to a voluntary hospital, voluntary meant voluntary. That meant that you actually worked on a voluntary basis. You got a very small stipend, but you made your livelihood out of private practice. Now, in those days, nearly all the doctors had their consulting rooms in Fitzwilliam Square, but I decided to be unconventional, and Rosemary and myself just bought a small bungalow in Roebuck, and we decided to convert some of the rooms in the bungalow into a consulting room and a surgery, and Rosemary acted as my secretary, receptionist, and financial controller. And I started my practice in the Palms, in this house. It's where we started our love of gardening in the Palms, because Rosemary was a great gardener and very particular about the way everything was kept. We were there for a year when we were blessed with the arrival of our first child, Kathy, who's here with me tonight. And it was such a joy in our life. First there was 1, then there was 2. And at this stage it became more difficult for Rosemary. I always remember one day she was always ready, welcoming people to the place. I'd operated on a lady called McCullen, Mrs. McCullen. Her son was a colleague of mine. He's an ENT surgeon in Vincent's, Oliver. And he said that he would collect his mother after I had reviewed her. So Rosemary was expecting Oliver to call. Now, the name McCall isn't too unlike McCullen. So the next man who knocks on the door is Mr. McCall. And he says, I'm Mr. McCall. And Rosemary opens the door in her usual fashion, welcoming fashion, and said, you're most welcome. Your mother's in the kitchen. The only problem was Mr. McCall's mother had died years before. I have to say he was a little bit taken back. So we decided at that stage it was really time for me to get out my practice out of the house. So we bought an apartment in Merrion Court, and we set it up for practice. This was just opposite Vincent, so it was convenient for me. And in those days I put in an X-ray unit, and also I had a computer at that stage, a Wang computer, and this was my start of an electronic patient record. 50 years later, only 15% of our public hospitals have an electronic patient record. It's just hard to believe how long it takes for things to change. I was joined there by a radiographer called Yvonne, and who has Teresa, a nurse, and later by Margaret, a secretary, and Joe, another radiographer. And I'm delighted to welcome them here tonight and to thank them for the extraordinary help that they gave me over the years. They stuck with me until I retired from that length of time, and how they put up with me for that length of time, I'll never know. But they were so good to me and to so many patients, and the care that they gave to so many people. Thank you so much for all you did. Now, this brings us up to 1980. That's a decade after I came back, and the religious orders were losing control because the financial control was largely taken over by the state. This is pre-HSE times. It was the Department of Health were controlling the purse strings and providing the services. And they decided that the times were tough, and they decided they'd cut back on the services at that stage. I had the fortune, or should I say the misfortune, to have to deal with 16 ministers of health in my time, and it wasn't easy to deal with them. But in 1980 there was a serious lack of modern facilities. The only facility for cardiac surgery was in the Mater Public Hospital. Implant surgery was in Kappa, and a small little unit that I developed with the sisters in Mount Carmel. And most of the work was still done in public hospitals, and there was a huge deficit of modern diagnostic services. And the state, in their wisdom, decided that implant surgery was somewhat of a luxury. You couldn't stop people coming in with an acute appendix or something of that nature, but that if people were required an implant, they didn't really have to fund it. So they cut back on the funding of implants. And at that stage I was doing about 10 artificial joints a week in Kappa, and I was rationed to 2 a fortnight. So I was largely redundant. And it came to a head because I had a group of visiting surgeons coming over to see a knee implant, and they wouldn't fund the knee joint for me. And I had a major row, and I finally got one knee joint for them to put in for this group of surgeons. But I was very frustrated. Now, one of Rosemary's great qualities was her friendship. She had an extraordinary ability to be friendly to people. And she met one of our neighbours, Joan Campbell, seen in this picture. She hadn't met Joan before, but they were chatting, and she invited Joan to come in to our home one evening for supper with her husband, Pat. Now, Pat happened to be an architect, and we were sitting at the fireside. At this stage, we had moved a year before to Booterstown Parish, to Cross Avenue, to our home there. And we were sitting at the fire discussing about the woes of my problems with inability to really use the skills that I wanted to use, and how bad the services were. At the end of the night, Pat and myself shook hands, and we said we're going to do something about it, and we're going to build a hospital, to develop a hospital that will deal with implants, cardiac surgery, and areas that are being neglected in the country. Now, at that stage, 30% of people had private insurance, so at least we could look after those, take them out of the public system, but we couldn't really do anything for the other 70%. But we said we'd try and do something, and that was the birth of the Blackrock Clinic. I contacted some friends. The first person I met actually was Maurice Nelligan coming out of the church here in Booterstown one Sunday. And I said to Maurice, what I had in mind. And he said, look, I have the same problem. I've got 5 years waiting list for cardiac surgery. I'd love to join in. George Duffy, a colleague in Vincent's, was in nuclear medicine, was frustrated. He joined in. My brother in America was due to come back to join me, and he joined in. So a small nucleus just got together. Now, it so happened that a short time later, a house came up for sale on Rock Road, and it had 5 acres of land. The house wasn't of any interest. It was 2 centuries old, but it was going for auction, and you couldn't really put an exact price, but it was possibly up to £1 million, and £1 million in 1981 was a lot of money. And I had a mortgage, having moved house. I hadn't a bob at the time, and my work was diminishing. But I had looked after a patient seen on the left here of the screen called Maurice O'Kelly. He's chatting here to Rosemary and Fergal Quinn. And Maurice was the managing director of Guinness Mahon Bank. And I operated on Maurice, and I was visiting him late one night. And he said, your lifestyle is absolutely desperate. I see you here early in the morning, late at night. You obviously can't look after your own affairs. And if I can ever help you looking after your financial affairs, he said, I'd be delighted to do so. So now that was music to my ears. And I decided I'd lift up the phone and I'd ring Maurice O'Kelly. And I said, Maurice, how are you fixed for a quick £1 million? And I had nothing to put against it. So I explained to him what I wanted to do, and he said, count me in. So I sent my late cousin, Jim Sheehan, seen in the middle of this photograph. And he went along to the auction with his son Jerry, and I'm delighted to welcome Jerry here tonight, who was a junior solicitor at that time. And Jerry, thank you for all you've done for us over all those years and setting us off on this path. I can never forgive you for setting us off on this path. But Jerry and Jim went to the auction, and they paid just under £1 million for the site. And the die was cast at that stage. This is an interesting picture because on Jim's left-hand side is my brother-in-law, Jimmy Sheehan, because Rosemary's maiden name was Sheehan, and the 3 Jim Sheehans in this picture. Pat Campbell and his group got involved, and with Pat and his group, Rosemary and myself were very involved in the design of the hospital. One little aspect of the hospital that I always remember is the statues, which are very much part and parcel of the atrium of the hospital. We saw these statues in Harrods around the time we were building the hospital, and we thought they'd be very nice in the atrium. But we tried to find out the artist and where he lived, because we weren't paying Harrods prices for them. It took us 3 visits to Harrods before we could finally extract the name and the address. So we visited the artist and we designed the fountain and the atrium with the artist there, and I think it stood the test of time. So the clinic opened in 84, and following that the hospital in 86. The hospital was subsequently extended about 10 years ago. Now I continued to work while Rosemary was rearing the children in this intervening period from between 84 and 2000. I opted out of the public system after 17 years. The more I got involved in Blackrock and continued to work in Mount Carmel, and continued to work in a very busy way. Over that period, I put in something in the region of 12,000 hips and knees into patients, and operated on something in the region of 100,000 patients, I reckon, over my lifetime. The year 2000, I was approached by some people in the west of Ireland to say that the services in the west of Ireland were really in very poor straits. We never seem to have our health services right here, do we? There's always problems, no matter when you look at it. But 2000 in Galway was particularly bad. They had no cardiac surgery, for example, so that if patients had an angioplasty or a catheter that went wrong, they died because you couldn't put them on bypass. They couldn't get up to Dublin, to the only cardiac centre in the country. There was no radiotherapy. People with cancer had to come and live in Dublin for 6 weeks just for the sake of 10 minutes treatment a day. They had very little cancer services, and the diagnostic services were very poor. So the more I thought about it, the more I said, look, could I do something about it? I was very hesitant because I was 62 at the time. I was trying to cut down on my work rather than take anything on, and I really didn't want to get involved in business again. And I said, look, I'd look at it, but the more I looked at it and the more these people pestered me, I sort of finally gave in, and I said, yeah, let's try and do something about it. So after a lot of thought with Rosemary, we decided, because Rosemary at this stage, the kids were well underway and we both had more time. So I tailed down my surgery. I didn't stop completely for a further 2 years, but we got involved in the design of a new hospital for Galway, and I submitted it for planning. I'd been offered a site in Galway by one of the locals. He said, look, he'd love to donate the site. We could just pay him a nominal rent for the site, and it was agricultural land, but it had to be rezoned. And to rezone from agricultural to amenity, which allows for a hospital, it had to go to the local council. And the local council have to vote with 2/3 plus 1 of a majority for rezoning. So I submitted the plans. It cost a lot of money. It was about $500,000 expenditure to get that far. I submitted the plans, and the council lost the vote by 1. And the casting vote was our current socialist president, who was a councillor at the time, President Michael D., and he was totally opposed to private healthcare. And we lost the vote, and I was absolutely disgusted. So around that time, Sean Mulryan, who was a builder, had a large tract of land, and he had the opposite problem because it was zoned amenity out in Liffey Valley, and he couldn't do any, and he applied for housing on 2 occasions and was returned down for housing. So he approached me and said, look, is there any way you could use the Galway plans and build a hospital in Liffey Valley? So I revamped the plans. We put them on a mirror image of the plans we had in Galway, readjusted them for the site because it was a different type of site, and applied for planning. During this time, the mayor and some of the council arrived on my doorstep from Galway, and they pleaded with me to reapply for Galway. And after a lot of persuasion, I decided, okay, I'll give it another chance. They guaranteed that it would go through on the vote, and I reapplied and it went through, and we continued with Galway. So that was the start of the Galway Clinic. Now this is an interesting picture. This is Rosemary in Ronald Reagan's bed. Now, with my blessing, Ronald wasn't there, but what happened when he was president, he visited Ireland, as you know, and stayed in Ashford Castle, and we stayed there a short time later, and we were put into Ronald's room, and I thought it was an appropriate place to take this photograph. And the reason I'm showing it is Rosemary wasn't just a sleeping partner, she was very much hands-on, because every aspect of our development from then on, she was a major part of it. She looked after all the finances of apart from the design that she was very involved with me in, because we'd visited hospitals at this stage of our life all over the world, and we had certain ideas about what we'd like to see. So she walked the site with me every week, but she managed all the finances, and both the Galway and Hermitage Clinic each cost 100 million, and I tell you, there was no cost overruns. She managed it down to the last halfpenny, and was an extraordinary, capable financial controller. The design of the Galway Clinic was totally different, and you can see how things have evolved now. The accommodation is now down to 20%. It's the exact opposite of what it was in the Nightingale era, because the rest of the hospital is diagnostic services, operating theatres, outpatients, and all the ancillary services. What I was very keen with Galway was that we'd have a whole new approach to hospital design. we were trying to use the natural lighting and ventilation, again going back to some aspects of the Nightingale era, getting away from the solid floor plates, and also to try and make it the most efficient hospital in the country. And in fact, it was the first truly digital hospital worldwide, where we used every digital convenience that we could, including the first hospital with a full electronic patient record. And in fact, it was the first hospital anywhere in the world that never had a porter, and still hasn't got a porter. And I don't know of any other hospital anywhere that hasn't got a porter, because everything was automated to try and smoothen the patient's journey as much as possible. The atrium has Rosemary's footprint all over it. Because of her musical interest, we had visited the new Mayo Clinic in Scottsdale in Arizona some time before, because we were always looking at hospitals, and they had a grand piano in a relatively small atrium, and we decided that wouldn't it be nice to have a grand piano in Galway. So we went out to the Piano Plus, the piano shop in Dublin, and they had this nice Yamaha piano with an automatic player. It wasn't cheap, but we were sort of pondering, because we had an awful lot of other equipment to get, and we were sort of saying, could we really justify a piano? So we said to the salesman, have you sold many of these? And he said, well, the last one he said I sold was to a car sales room in Cahersiveen in Kerry. So he said, God, if they can have it in Cahersiveen in a car sales room, we'll have it in the Galway Clinic. So that was the advent. The rug that it's on, we've had a holiday home in the west of Ireland for many years, and our neighbours ran the Vazovsky Joyce factory. And the circular carpet that you see there was in a showroom in Abu Dhabi, and they closed the showroom and they had it thrown in the back of their warehouse. And they opened it out and said, look, is there any way we could use this? So we actually designed the floor of the atrium around that carpet. They made the remainder of the blue carpet, and the remainder of the floor is in stone. But these are the sort of touches that Rosemary added to the hospital. 20 years after Galway is built, I still don't know of any hospital, even if I say so myself, that has the ambience and the attractiveness of the clinic in Galway. It's unique in the medical world. Bertie Ahern did us the honour of opening it. Just for clarification, he didn't do the official blessing, much as he'd like to have done it. But Rosemary presented him with a bowl, and on the bowl we inscribed it Bertie's Western Bowl, because you remember at the time he was frustrated about the Bertie Bowl that didn't happen. He visited, he's a very good friend to us indeed, Bertie. He visited the hospital a few months before it was completed, and we were equipping it at the time. One of the local TDs tagged on, you know the way they always get an entourage of people hanging on when they come. This TD was hanging on to Bertie, and as Bertie went around, this guy kept saying, you know, it's not right that the private sector is having radiotherapy when there's none in the West. Why don't you divert the equipment to the public hospital? And he was very anti what we were doing. And of course, Rosemary had very astute hearing and was listening to what was going on. So when Bertie had finished his tour and this TD was pulling away in his chauffeur-driven car, Rosemary hailed them down, and she said, do you mind if I have a word? So he pulls down the window. And now if Rosemary says to anyone, do you mind if I have a word? Beware, ask my kids and they'll tell you. So he gets out, and Rosemary said, you know, she said, we've put our sweat and guts into this place, and how dare you talk to the Taoiseach in the terms you were doing. He said, you know, she said, it's totally unacceptable. I don't think I've ever seen a politician speechless, but he got back into his car and drove away. But there was no one more direct than Rosemary in her dealings, and yet in such a nice way. I always remember the night of the millennium. We had a lovely dinner at home with some friends, and then we went down to the roof of the Blackrock Clinic to see the fireworks in Dublin Bay. And we were tucked into bed, and I turned around to Rosemary and I said, have you made your New Year's resolution? And she said, indeed I have. And I said, would you share it with me? And she said, from now on I'm going to call a spade a spade. And I said, my God, what have you been doing for the last 35 years? So I decided that her motto now was going to be nomine rutrum rutrum, to call a spade a spade. The Hermitage Clinic, when I finished Blackrock, we turned our attention to the Hermitage Clinic, and 2 years later, the mirror image of Galway opened in the Hermitage, and again Bertie did us the honours. This particular picture is poignant for me because the day before I had a phone call from South America to say that an elderly aunt of mine was dying, was critically ill. And this aunt was very close to me because she prayed every day that she was very devoted to Our Lady, and she prayed every day that Our Lady would find me a suitable wife. And by God, she did. So she was dying, and we got the news the day before, and Rosie and myself joined with my sister Frances, and from the opening of the Hermitage, we drove out to the airport and we flew out to a very remote area of West Brazil, Cuiabá, where my aunt was there. And we had the privilege of spending the last week of her life with her. She died just a few days after we left. But it was wonderful to have that opportunity. My aunt was very committed to the Legion of Mary and had started the Legion of Mary. She was 70 years in the missions in South America, between Argentina and Brazil. And she started the Legion of Mary in various areas, but she always wanted to meet Frank Duff. But Rosie and myself had been members of the Legion of Mary before he emigrated, and I'd met Frank Duff on many occasions, so I arranged for him to meet my aunt, and it was the highlight of her tour. And she was so pleased to have actually met Frank. Now, Ray Kinsella's next talk in this series is on Frank Duff, and I'm sure it'll be absolutely fascinating, and we look forward to it, Ray. My final decade in medical care was divided between administration and efforts at the Children's Hospital. Galway Clinic was running for about 3 years. We got a very poor deal from the VHI, which is the major insurer at that time, because I insisted that anyone in Galway who had any form of medical insurance would have to be covered for the clinic, not fancy plans like they had for Blackrock and the private matter. So they only gave us 70% of the going rate. And after 3 years, we had accumulated losses of about 8.5 million. We'd gone through 3 CEOs, and it wasn't in a very healthy position. So I decided I'd take on the role of CEO myself, never having done so before. And Rosie and myself divided our time between Dublin. We spent the majority of the week in Galway for a 5-year period. And I'm delighted that over that time we were able to turn it around from a loss-making situation. All the debts were cleared, and it actually was the most profitable private hospital at the end of that time after 5 years. I had a distinct policy that nobody could talk about finance. And my motto was that if you look after the patient, the bottom line will look after itself, and it truly did. So we had a wonderful time, and in fact, when I look back, I think those years were the most enjoyable years of my professional life, because we did so much, and I'll talk about it because my sons were involved with me. My final episode was to try and do something for the Children's Hospital. I was co-opted to the board of Crumlin many years ago to try and help them redevelop Crumlin. Crumlin was owned by the church, was on a 10-acre site which really couldn't expand because there was housing all around it. And the more I looked at it, the more I decided that you couldn't really do anything much about the site there, that you really needed a new site. Having built the Hermitage Clinic, there was 50 acres of land adjacent to it. So I approached Sean Mulrine, the builder, and he offered to donate the 50 acres for a children's hospital. So I had plans drawn up, and I approached Cardinal Connell, who was the chairman of the board and also in charge of Crumlin at that time. And he was coming towards the end of his tenure, and he didn't really want to get involved. I put a proposition to him because I said, wouldn't it be wonderful if the church, at that time I suggested selling some of their lands, particularly up in Clonliffe, because it had closed at that time, and putting that money and fundraising for the remainder, and that the church would donate this to the state, particularly in reparation for any of the wrongdoing that had happened over the years. He thought it was a great idea, but he didn't want to act on it. He told me, look, leave it for his successor. So I took it up with Archbishop Eamon Martin, but around that time, the politicians decided rather than having one new children's hospital, instead of having a new Crumlin, let's amalgamate the three and have one new children's hospital. And Bertie Ahern, Mary Harney and the Archbishop got together and decided that the Mater site would be the most appropriate. And you all know what happened with the Mater site. So after the Mater, they were talking about where would they develop it, and I felt very strongly that it should be a greenfield site. They were talking about James as another possible site, but I felt that the worst possible site was James's, where it was landlocked and you would have to demolish all the existing buildings to make a site. And I got involved with a group of people called the Connolly for Kids, and we campaigned for a new hospital on the Connolly site, and I offered to build it purely on a voluntary basis on that site, and had plans drawn up for it. And sadly, it never came to anything. But Rosie and myself campaigned very vigorously, and this picture on the left-hand side, where there's a group of us, Rosie and myself were in that group, handing in a petition to the Taoiseach at the time with 60,000 signatures requesting that they listen to us about Connolly for Kids. But as you know, the battle continues. This was the hospital we designed for the Greenfield site. It would have been a fantastic, and it was one of my great regrets in life that I never got to do this as my final contribution. Now, preserving our Catholic ethos has been a major part of Rosemary's and my involvement in healthcare, because I had such regard for what was happening, and I was always very conscious in medicine too that, you know, when the Lord was on earth, he spent his time preaching and healing. And when you think of the people he was healing the lame, he was healing the blind and looking after the lepers. And he's now transferred those natural abilities to the medical profession, where we can heal the lame in many cases, we can cure the blind with cataracts, and leprosy is gone. So they were really very much continuing the Lord's work, and the Catholic ethos is an absolutely integral part to me of continuing on that path. So we were absolutely determined that any involvement we had with hospitals would have to be based on a Catholic ethos, with a Catholic chaplain, a chapel as a central point in the hospital, and no procedures undertaken that were ever contrary to the Catholic teaching. This is the little oratory in Galway, which we were particularly proud of. The stained glass windows we came across in an antique shop in London. They'd been taken out of a convent many years before that. They'd been made in the early studios in Camden Street a century before, and we found them, we had them refashioned, and we designed the oratory largely around those windows. But the oratory is designed that it seems to be floating on an infinity pool of water, so that when you're sitting in it, you have a lovely tranquil atmosphere with the water lapping around outside it. The Christian virtues, where is it more important but in healthcare to have these virtues? Because when people are sick, how many of them want to come back to their faith and listen to the priest and look to the future? Hope is such an integral part of healthcare, because some people are sick and terminally ill, and their only hope, they're just hoping that they might live to see their children make their first communion, or maybe some of their kids get married. We must never take away hope. Some people are only hoping to see their son rise the following morning, and hope is something that, one of the virtues that is absolutely essential to healthcare. And love, what greater way of looking after people than showing them love when sometimes they're at their lowest point. When I look back on what happened over my half century in healthcare, I started with only x-rays. There was nothing else. Now there's about 10 modalities. It's just extraordinary what's happened over that time. Every operation that I trained in my early days was obsolete by the time I finished. So that you were continually retraining. And it's the same like with imaging. Did I ever believe you could look inside the body in 3 dimensions, what you can now see on MRI scans? Some pictures from Galway. a modern operating theatre for artificial joints, robotic surgery, which is extremely sophisticated. This is the highest end sort of a sophistication you can have in surgery, where the surgeon can sit in any part of the world, and as long as he's connected by broadband, he can operate on the patient. Interventional surgery, where you put in artificial aortas and various spare parts under X-ray control with minimal invasive. With all these extraordinary developments in healthcare, did I ever think in my lifetime that this would come about and that we would have abortion in Ireland? And to me, it's one of the saddest things that I've ever seen, because when healthcare is no longer about healing, there's no end to what can happen in healthcare. And I think it's extraordinary to think that we're now diametrically opposite to what they're doing in America, having reversed Roe versus Wade, and we're going the opposite direction. And I greatly worry about our future, and it makes it all the more important that our Catholic ethos is preserved whenever possible. The politicians can make any rules they want and any laws, but as St. Thomas Aquinas said, an unjust law is a human law that's not rooted in the eternal law and the natural law. And we are making laws that are just so alien to our views in Catholic hospitals. Now, I just want to briefly mention a few of other Rosemary's involvements, and I'm sorry that I'm overrunning my time, but she had so many other involvements. I had the privilege of looking after Jacqueline O'Brien, Vincent O'Brien's wife, the horse trainer, some years ago. And Jacqueline wanted to do something for arthritic patients. So she decided to set up a small committee with Rosemary and a few other of Jacqueline's friends and raise money. And over the course of a year, the committee raised about £500,000, which is a lot of money in the 1980s. And we put in sterile air theatres and hydrotherapy units in various parts of the country in the public system, which was greatly in need at the time. But the end of the fundraising campaign was a gala dinner and fundraising banquet auction one night, followed by a race meeting in the Phoenix Park. And Jacqueline O'Brien was very friendly with Larry Hagman, who's seen in the photograph here, and she invited him over as a celebrity guest. And Larry came over acting the part. He was throwing fake dollar bills around the place and acting the aegis as he did in his TV series. Now, we met him at the dinner and the auction the night before, and we were introduced to him. And the children wanted naturally to meet him the following day at the race meeting, so Jacqueline arranged for us to meet him. So when Rosemary was reintroduced to Larry Hagman, in his typical fashion, in his Texan brawl, he says, "Gee, I didn't know you today with your clothes on." So Irene, our 7-year-old, goes into her good Catholic school the following day, all excited having met JR, and they said, "What did he say?" "He didn't know my mammy with her clothes on." So he really lived up to the part. Rosie and myself have been involved with Net Ministries for many years, and I'm delighted to welcome Bishop Fonzie here. Thank you for joining us, Bishop Fonzie. Bishop Fonzie is the chairman of Net Ministries, and they're a group of young volunteers, about 50 each year, who come together. They undergo intensive training for a 2-month period, and after that then they go into parishes in groups of 5, and they've made an enormous contribution over a number of years in various parishes. One of Rosemary's and my last decisions together was to bring them to Boothstown Parish, and they came here just sadly 2 months after she died. They started in the parish, and I think they're an extraordinary group of young people invigorating our youth and bringing the Lord to them. One of the great advantages is that they've had a number of vocations, and one of the youth who was with us in Boothstown Parish, one boy, is now studying for the priesthood, and they've had at least 10 others going on for the priesthood. While we worry in this day and age about the future of priests in the country, the future is with youth ministry, whether it's with Net Ministries, whether it's with Youth 2000, the focus group in the universities. And I'd ask everybody to support youth ministry because it's the future of our church, and Rosie and myself were passionate about it. Legatus was an American organisation founded by a man called Tom Monaghan. He started Domino Pizzas and he sold it out and devoted his finances to charitable causes. He started a university called Ave Maria University in Florida. But he also set up an organisation for business people that they would get together every month, have mass, prayer, a talk and discussion group. And we were fortunate to join this when it started in Ireland in the year 2003. It was brought to Ireland by a lady called Marion Mulhall, and we were with them for a number of years. And 10 years later, in 2013, Rosie and myself were rewarded the highest honour that they could give us. Out of all their American chapters, they appointed us the Ambassadors of the Year. And it was a great honour for us to receive this in Florida. But Rosie was a huge part of Legatus and really helped organise it in Ireland throughout her lifetime. The final area just to talk briefly about, because of my involvement with knee joints, I travelled extensively. I was invited to lecture and operate, in fact, in many parts of the world, and developed a great rapport with a lot of surgeons. And we had a constant trickle of surgeons visiting us in Ireland. But a lot of the surgeons were Irish American. And after some years, we decided that we would form an association between the Irish orthopedic surgeons and those in America. And in 1979, Rose and myself, with an American colleague, the late Jim Devlin from Michigan, set up the Irish American Orthopedic Association. And we had our first meeting in Killarney. It was attended by about 100 people. Paddy Hilary was president, and he came down and he played golf with the Americans. They couldn't believe they were playing golf with our president. And we had a great get-together. 40 years later, as the thriving organisation, the main principle really for founding it was to further relations between colleagues on both sides of the Atlantic, to help with training of our colleagues and to get them placed in the best centres in the United States. And I'm delighted to say that so many of them have got placements over that time. I'd love to talk about so many other of Rosemary's involvements, but I know if she's looking down at me tonight, she always called me Jim, and she said, "Jim, would you ever stop talking about me?" She said, "You're going senile." You know, and I could just see her saying, "Look, cut it out." In summer of 2017, she became acutely ill, and her life hung in the balance for a number of weeks. She was in Blackrock and the clinic, and after about 2 months, she stabilised, and about 2 months later, she was able to get home, but very incapacitated with lung disease at that time. The night she arrived, when she was in hospital, she texted me regularly throughout the stay, and just one of the texts to give you an idea of Rosemary's, she said, "If I get over this, I will look after you forever." And that was the sort of person she was. She was never thinking of herself, she was always thinking of me and others. The night she got home from hospital, I had a phone call from Archbishop Eamon Martin to say that Pope Francis had appointed me as a papal knight, which is the greatest honour that one could have bestowed on a lay person in the church. Now, I felt that Rosemary was more deserving of it than me, and I decided that I couldn't receive it until she was well enough. So after 4 months, she was well enough to attend the ceremony. So her first outing in 4 months was to the church in Booterstown, where I was conferred with the honour. But I felt that it was a joint honour because she did much more to deserve it than I did. You see on the left of this picture, the late Father Jerry Byrne, our beloved Father Jerry, our chaplain in Blackrock for all those years, from the time it started until his death some 2 years ago. And beside him, his great friend, Bishop Eamon, who is with us here tonight. And I'd like to sincerely thank Bishop Eamon, who in his retirement I emphasise, has taken on the full-time chaplaincy in Blackrock Clinic to ensure that we have a full-time chaplain. Bishop Eamon, we're so grateful to you for that. There's also on the picture the late Seamus Conway, our late parish priest, who was so beloved to us all in this parish. I was so happy that Rosemary was able to partake in that occasion. Over the next few months, her health slowly deteriorated, and she was admitted to Blackrock for the last 10 days of her life. The last 24 hours, we clung on to each other, and we held between us in our hands a small little crucifix. And this crucifix was very special to Rosemary because it had a relic of the true cross, but it was held by her father, her mother, and her sister, all in their dying moments. And we held that together until I finally had to leave her go from my hands into the hands of the Lord. And I've no doubt that He brought her straight to heaven because of her goodness to so many people. Now, her heritage lives on in our 4 wonderful children that we've been so blessed with. A year after her death was my 80th birthday, and they brought me down to my roots in Kerry, where my paternal grandfather came from, in Kinmare. My eldest daughter, Kathy, who's with me here tonight, as my other 2 sons are. Unfortunately, one of them, my daughter, can't make it. But Kathy has followed in my footsteps and is a surgical pathologist. And I'm so proud of Kathy because she's leading the field in Ireland in digital pathology, which allows you to apply artificial intelligence to the interpretation of slides. And she's outstanding in her field of specialisation in the country. And not alone that, but she's a very keen sailor. This isn't in Dublin Bay. This is at the helm of a transatlantic race. So she's a fearless sailor. And Kathy has put together this slideshow for me tonight, and her IT skills are absolutely superb. Kathy, thank you. I can't thank her enough for all she does for me. Irene, my second daughter, is an architect in London, met an architect in London. I used to say to Rosemary, he's very nice, but he's English. And then she said, no, you can't say that. You have to say he's very nice and he's English. You know, so she settled there with 3 children, and she was very involved in the conceptual design of the Galway Clinic with me. My 2 sons, Michael and Mark, I hardly ever saw them when they were young because I was always out working, and Rosemary looked after them. The happiest time of my life really was working with the 2 of them. Michael became very involved in the whole construction of the clinics, equipping, rounding up the doctors, and the commissioning. Mark came down to Galway as we were commissioning it, and he worked with me there for 10 years. And he introduced so many innovations to healthcare that it was just unbelievable. And I think those years that I spent with the 2 of them were quite extraordinary from my point of view, and they were the high point of my professional life. Michael and his wife Erica were expecting a baby before Rosemary died, and they rang up the obstetrician 2 days before to know was it a little boy or a little girl, and the obstetrician said it was a little girl. So they went into Rosemary. She was still conscious at the time, and they said they were expecting a little girl and they were going to call her Rose. And Rose has a special place in my heart. I love all the grandchildren, but Rose has a special place. This picture was taken on a cold winter's day. I think it was St. Stephen's Day down in Galway. There's no one else mad enough to be out on the sea, but this lone figure who was taken jumping off the diving board by a passer-by. That's my Mark. Full of guts and ready for any adventure. We've been blessed with 8 grandchildren, which are Rosemary's heritage again. 6 of them are there, and subsequently 2 twins from Mark and Emma's twins, who are now 2 years of age, and they're such a joy in my life. My life now is very simple. I spend a lot of time in the garden that Rosemary and myself cultivated over the last 40 years in Boothstown, and I get great pleasure and I find great solace in working in the garden in her memory. And Kathy, my daughter, is a great gardener and helped me. For my 70th birthday, Rosemary gave me a glass house. She said in the hope of distracting me from visiting hospitals that she felt it'd be far less stressful for her if she could lock me in the glass house. Kathy looks after all the vegetables and is a very keen gardener. She's great green fingers and a great help to me. The rest of my time, I go occasionally down to Galway, where we have our home, and I mentioned, and Mark takes me out fishing. This was a few weeks ago on the Corrib. Mark is a very keen fisherman. This is during the mayfly fishing. Any fish that are caught are photographed and returned to the lake. He doesn't believe in killing any fish. Our local parish church in Galway is Uachtarard Parish, and the church is 200 years old and has been fashioned recently. They've built a small little Blessed Sacrament chapel off the main church, and this chapel is going to be dedicated by the Bishop of Galway to Rosemary's memory on her 4th anniversary coming this August. My final tribute to my darling Rosemary, I leave to the lyrics of the song, "The Wind Beneath My Wings."